Okay, we are at 2 o'clock. So good morning and welcome to this afternoon's Senior Connections virtual gathering. Thank you for joining in. I'm Bob Kibrick and I'll be talking today about challenges to democracy in the United States. If you have questions about the topic, please type them into the chat window and I'll try to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the talk. If I don't get to your question today, please send it to my email address, which is listed in the Temple directory and which someone will probably put in the chat window. And I will try to, as best as possible, to answer your question via email. Please note that this Zoom session is being recorded so that those unable to participate today can view it at a later time. And if you prefer not to be part of a recording, then you should disconnect from the Zoom session now. And disclaimers, the views presented in this talk are strictly my own, do not reflect the view of any of the organizations with which I'm affiliated, including but not limited to Temple Beth El, University of California, Liquor Keck Observatories, or Verified Voting. And while I'll do my best to keep this talk nonpartisan, you should note that I'm a registered Democrat and have been so for over 50 years, so that bias may creep into this talk from time to time. My talk will be in 5 parts as listed on this slide. So first, a little about my background. It's in computer science, physical sciences, and electronics. I've spent most of my career helping to develop control systems for astronomical telescopes and instruments at Lick Observatory in California and at the Keck Observatory in Hawaii. I also developed software to enable instruments on the Keck telescopes to be operated remotely over the internet from the sites in the US mainland. But I'm not a political scientist or a historian or a legal scholar, nor was I originally a political activist. So you're probably wondering, why am I giving a talk about challenges to democracy? Well, the short answer is it's my wife's fault. Many of you know Michelle either through Sisterhood or the Social Action Committee, and she's probably in one of these video windows here, or the choir where she's sung for many years. But what you might not know about Michelle is in the late 1970s and 80s, she was the administrative aide to the Santa Cruz City Council. And in 1979, she volunteered me to serve on a citizens committee that had been convened to evaluate a voting system that the city was planning to rent to conduct a city election that was not consolidated with the county. Well, while serving on that committee, I asked to see the software that was going to be used to count our votes. And I was told that the company's software was a proprietary trade secret and not available for inspection by anyone, including me. I was very troubled by that, and I dissented from the committee's majority decision to approve the voting system for use by the city. I was even more troubled to discover later that that kind of secrecy was the rule for just about every computerized voting system in use throughout the United States. At the time, I was in my 20s, and outside of my family, who I complained to about this all the time, no one seemed to take my concerns seriously, so I put them aside. It was more than 21 years later that a series of 5 events reawakened my concerns about voting systems and elections. The first event was the presidential election of 2000, where numerous problems with voting systems and procedures called the result into question. The second event was the passage by the US Congress of the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which was intended to address many of the voting system and procedural issues that came to light in the election of 2000. A key result of that act, known as HAVA for short, was to phase out punch card voting systems and lever machines and replace them with electronic touchscreen voting machines. The third event was the circulation in 2003 of the resolution on electronic voting. Over $1 billion in HAVA funding initially provided to states and counties had triggered widespread deployment of paperless touchscreen voting machines. This set off alarm bells throughout the computer science community, which was quick to recognize the risks that such machines posed to the verifiability of our elections. The resolution was endorsed by thousands of computer scientists and software professionals, myself included. Its author, computer science professor David Dill of Stanford University, went on to become the founder of Verified Voting, a nonpartisan nonprofit group that advocated for passage of legislation to require that all voting systems provide a voter-verified paper record for all votes. The fourth event was the introduction in May 2003 of H.R. 2239 by Representative Rush Holt of New Jersey. This bill would have amended HAVA to require that all voting systems used in elections for federal office must provide a voter-verified paper record of each voter's vote. Dr. Dill and the newly formed Verified Voting were key advocates for this bill. Sadly, it did not pass, nor did any of its successors in subsequent sessions of Congress. The fifth event was the pre-publication release in the fall of 2003 of an academic paper that analyzed the previously secret software of a popular touchscreen voting machine. That machine's vendor had carelessly and erroneously posted this software to a public server where it was inadvertently discovered and shared with the computer security researchers who authored this paper. The security vulnerabilities revealed in this paper were absolutely jaw-dropping. It was this fifth event that finally inspired me to become a voting integrity activist. So in the fall of 2003, I became a volunteer with the Verified Voting and Verified Voting Foundation. I served as their legislative analyst for the next 5 years. I also signed up to become a poll worker for the Santa Cruz County Elections Department. And with one exception, I've worked in every election since then, including the recent primary election on March 3rd. In my role at Verified Voting, I presented testimony to state legislative committees in several states, and I helped with the drafting of legislation that was enacted in 18 states to require voting systems to produce a voter-verified paper record. I also helped with the drafting of several similar federal bills by legislators on both sides of the aisle, but unfortunately, none of those passed the US Congress. So I want to talk next about the mechanics of US elections to provide background for what's going to come after. Elections have many components. In this talk, I'll focus on those primarily from the perspective of voters. For them, the process of elections begins with registering to vote. There are several modes to do that, depending upon where you live. You can register via paper forms or online prior to an election, or in many localities on election day at either a polling place or vote center. In some states, registration occurs automatically when applying for a driver's license. Elections officials are responsible for maintaining the voter registration database and providing to poll workers the information they need to verify that poll workers arriving to vote are properly registered. Depending on the state, voters have a choice of various voting modes, such as in-person at a polling place on election day, early voting at a polling site prior to the election, or submitting an absentee or vote by mail ballot through US mail or depositing it in a drop box. For those voting in person, there are several technologies for casting votes as well as for counting them. After election day, preliminary results may be subject to recounts and audits prior to the certification of official results. And alongside all of these activities is the periodic, once every 10 years, process of redistricting, which will determine what legislative district each voter's residence is assigned. States and counties play the overwhelmingly dominant role in determining the details of how our elections are carried out. State legislators Legislatures are responsible for election codes, which specify things like dates of elections, hours of voting, requirements for obtaining absentee ballots, and rules for audits and recounts. Most state legislatures are also responsible for redistricting, although a growing number of states are transferring that role to independent redistricting commissions. Secretaries of State are the chief elections officers and are typically responsible for testing and certification of voting systems, voter registration systems, and management of statewide ballot measures. At the local level, county registrars or clerks are responsible for the nuts and bolts of elections. They define the boundaries of voting precincts, arrange for polling places, recruit and train poll workers, design and print ballots, administer absentee ballots, and tabulate and certify the election results. There are over 3,000 counties in the US, and each one has its own election procedures. There's a very limited federal role in elections. The US Constitution provides very little detail about the conduct of elections, leaving most of that responsibility to the states. Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, which is referred to as the Election Clause, simply reads, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations." That's it. Various landmark judicial decisions regarding the extent of federal authority in both the conduct of elections and legislative redistricting have hinged on how different courts have interpreted the meaning of this clause. Also of note is that neither the Constitution nor the Bill of Rights contains any explicit affirmative guarantee of the right to vote, initially leaving to the states the decision of who is entitled to vote. Subsequent amendments to the Constitution have simply limited the power of states to restrict the right to vote based on specific factors, such as the ones listed here. Race, color, or previous servitude in the 15th Amendment, sex, non-payment of poll tax, age, and so forth. The landscape in which US elections are conducted is continually changing, sometimes on a weekly or even daily basis. This is the result of a variety of factors, the latest of which is the COVID-19 crisis, which continues to scramble the deck. Changes in the conduct of elections or the processes of redistricting occur as state legislators approve new law, while state and federal courts delay, modify, or strike down existing laws or regulations. Other changes occur when initiatives or referenda are approved by voters, or when state or local officials adopt new regulations or procedures. At the same time, voting system vendors roll out new voting systems, which provide not only new features, but also introduce new security vulnerabilities and reliability problems. Various voting technologies are currently used in the US. As the result of HAVA, mechanical lever machines and punch card voting systems are no longer in use. Most of the country uses one of three technologies: optical scan machine counted ballots, as we have here, ballot marking devices, or direct recording electronic voting machines, often called touchscreen voting machines. For each of these technologies, the various voting system vendors each provide their own versions. While a number of jurisdictions have proposed the use of online voting via the internet, no such systems have been widely deployed to date, and for good reason, since they pose extreme security vulnerabilities. While HAVA eliminated lever machines, many of you who previously lived in the Northeast or some parts of the South remember these massive mechanical marvels. While they provided an efficient means of vote casting and counting, they were a logistical challenge for elections departments to maintain and deploy, as they weighed close to 900 pounds. The biggest problem is they are not accessible to mobility impaired voters in wheelchairs. HAVA also eliminated punch card voting systems. Both forms of paper ballots, as shown on the right column, inherently provide a voter verified paper record of the voter's vote, so that in case of an audit or a recount, either can be counted or recounted by hand to verify the result. All direct electronic recording machines, voting machines, DREs, record the voter's vote on an electronic memory card inside the machine that the voter can't see or inspect. DREs come in several forms, such as touchscreen machines or ones that are controlled with scroll wheels and push buttons. Any type of DRE can be configured either with or without a printer that is used to print a paper copy of the voter's selections that the voter can inspect and verify prior to casting their vote. In the case of an audit or a recount, that paper record can be manually counted to check the accuracy of the DRE generated count. Ballot marking devices are effectively electronic pencils that can be used to mark a paper ballot. Voters make all of their selections on a touchscreen, very similar to the ones on DREs, and then the device prints a paper ballot. Voters can then inspect that paper ballot before putting it in a ballot box. Ballot marking devices, or BMDs, are intended primarily for voters with visual impairments or other disabilities, although they can be used by any voters. And this is, in fact, the particular one that we use in this county. Here are examples of two types of paper ballots used in our county. At left is the optical scan paper ballot that you would mark by hand by filling in the bubbles. At right is a paper ballot printed by the ballot marking device. The ballot lists the voter's selections in plain text and in an encrypted QR code that authenticates the ballot. In each case, after the voter has verified that the paper ballot correctly reflects their votes, they drop the ballot into the ballot box. At the close of those polls, those ballots are transported to the elections office where they are centrally tabulated. The purpose of elections is not to convince the winner or their supporters that they have won, but to convince the loser and their supporters that they have lost fair and square. In order to maintain confidence in the outcome of our elections, it is vital to verify that those results through various types of audits and recounts. Procedural audits occur in polling places after the polls have closed and include checking the number of voted ballots against the number of voters who signed in. During the canvass of the vote, the machine-generated tallies can be compared to a hand count of the paper ballots, either as the result of a post-election recount or an audit. The latter can either be traditional or risk limiting. If we have time, we'll come back and describe the differences between those. So with that background, we'll now look at the technical, legislative, procedural threats to fair elections. Due to time constraints, I will not discuss external threats, such as those posed by foreign governments or other malefactors who may attempt to interfere in our elections via cyber intrusions or similar means. So the five we'll be talking about are insecure or unreliable voting systems, suppression of voter registration, suppression of voting, gerrymandering and partisan redistricting, and the Electoral College. Excuse me. The fundamental problem with paperless DRE voting systems is that the voter has no means to verify that the machine has correctly recorded their votes, whether due to a programming mistake, hardware malfunction, or malicious tampering. The voter's selection, as shown on the display screen, might not match their votes as recorded inside the machine's memory card. This deficiency can at least be partially mitigated by attaching a printer to the DRE to generate a paper record that they can check before the vote is cast, and that can be used in a recount or audit. The problem with this mitigation is that it relies on the voter to take the time to check both their selections on the screen and on the printed record. Many voters do only the former and not the latter. The same concerns applies to ballot marking devices. The voter has to check their selections both here and on the printed ballot. And if they're in a hurry, they may never check the printed copy. Unfortunately, a number of jurisdictions throughout the US, including several states, continue to use paperless DRE voting systems that have repeatedly been shown to be insecure or otherwise unreliable. Many of these machines were purchased and deployed over 15 years ago when HAVA funding first became available. As a result, their hardware and software are now extremely obsolete, difficult to maintain. Jurisdictions have to scour eBay to find spare parts. Because of these problems, paperless DREs are sometimes referred to as faith-based voting systems, as shown in this cartoon. Unfortunately, the security and reliability issues associated with DRE voting machines are not confined to obsolete machines. Even new machines recently purchased and deployed have had serious problems. This New York Times article from November 2019 describes a serious malfunction of such machines during local elections in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, just last November. And basically within a few minutes of the polls closing, county election officials were in a panic. Vote totals in the county judge's race showed one candidate, a Democrat, had just 164 votes out of 55 ballots cast across more than 100 precincts. Some machines reported 0 votes for him. In a county with the ability to vote a straight party ticket, one candidate, 0 votes, was a near statistical impossibility. Something had gone very wrong. That recent incident appears to have been due to a system configuration error made by the voting systems contractor that the county had hired to set up the machines. Even though there does not seem to be any malicious intent here, such incidents still undermine the public's confidence in the outcome of elections. Fortunately, many jurisdictions are replacing their DRE voting systems with a combination of optical scan voting systems for use by most voters and ballot marking devices to provide voting access for voters with disabilities. This map, which is provided by Verified Voting's online interactive database of deployed voting systems, shows the different types of voting technologies that were used in the November 2016 presidential election. In states colored brown or orange, either all or some significant fraction of votes were cast on unverifiable paperless DREs, while those colored white or yellow used either paper ballots or DREs that had a voter verified paper record. Looking in more detail, this map shows on a county by county basis the voting technologies used in Pennsylvania during that election. Counties colored brown or orange used paperless DREs to record either all or some of their votes, thus precluding any kind of meaningful recount or audit in those counties. Thus, there is no way to say with certainty whether the vote tallies from those counties accurately represented the votes cast by the voters in those counties. This map shows the distribution of voting technologies that are expected to be used for the November 2020 presidential election. Only those jurisdictions colored brown will be using paperless DREs this November. All other counties will use technologies that provide some type of voter verified paper record that can be audited or recounted. This map shows Pennsylvania again on a county by county basis. And the good news is that unlike 2016, all Pennsylvania counties will be using either hand-marked optical scan paper ballots, as shown in white, or ballot marking devices, as shown in orange. Thus, all of those counties should be able to conduct meaningful recounts and audits this fall. Going forward, while this process won't be complete in time for the November election, The long-term trend for this decade, subject to funding, is for states and counties to migrate to optical scan paper ballots and ballot marking devices, as Pennsylvania has done. In addition, a growing number of states are moving to implement post-election audits to ensure that machine tabulations are routinely checked. And these are very encouraging trends. Unfortunately, even if every country in the US deployed secure, reliable, transparent, and verifiable voting technologies, and even if all of those counties routinely conducted robust, statistically based, risk limiting post-election audits for all contests, that by itself would not ensure that the results of our elections fairly reflect the will of the voters. So long as jurisdictions continue to engage in the other threats listed on this slide, and so long as the Electoral College can override the national popular vote for president, then we cannot claim that our elections are fair. So let's talk next about suppression of voter registration. Voters are not permitted to vote unless they are registered to vote. In various states and jurisdictions, legislatures and elections officials have engaged in partisan tactics to stifle the voter registration process for targeted groups, such as students or low-income voters. Such tactics include imposing significant indirect costs on voters by requiring the production of documents that low-income voters can't afford to obtain. Some states, like Florida, imposed what is essentially a lifetime registration ban for most ex-felons who have served their terms and been released from prison. Other tactics include imposing overly burdensome regulations on organizations such as the League of Women Voters that engage in voter registration drives, and causing them to stop those drives in areas where they feel it puts them at too much risk. Some tactics are more subtle. In 2017, Georgia enacted an exact match law mandating that voters' names on registration records must perfectly, when we're talking down to, initials and hyphenation of names, they must match perfectly their names on approved other forms of regulation, identification, such as driver's licenses. In the lead up to the 2018 election, approximately 80% of Georgia voters whose registrations were blocked by this law were people of color. Once registered, voters need to remain registered if they're to continue voting, while jurisdictions legitimately need to periodically update their voter registration databases to remove voters who have died or have moved out of the area. Some states and jurisdictions have engaged in partisan and unfair schemes to disproportionately remove targeted groups from the rolls of registered voters. Some schemes involve the overly aggressive purging of voters who simply failed to vote in the previous election. Other schemes, like the one used in Florida in 2000, involved purging the registrations of lawful voters whose names were similar but not identical to a list of convicted felons, including felons from other states. Other states have used similar schemes to purge the registrations of lawful citizens who were suspected of not being citizens because of having been born in counties close to the border with Mexico. Even for voters who are registered to vote, they can be discouraged from voting when jurisdictions engage in partisan tactics to make voting more difficult for targeted groups. Several years ago, many jurisdictions had enacted worthwhile reforms, such as early voting, to make voting easier for all voters. But legislatures in some states were appalled to discover that those reforms disproportionately increased voting participation by low-income voters, students, and people of color. In response, they have drastically limited the hours available for early voting. In a number of states, the distribution of voting equipment and staffing is grossly unequal between wealthy areas and low-income communities, leading to much longer lines at polling places located in those communities. A lot of low-income voters have multiple jobs and can't take that much time away from work to stand in line for hours to vote. Many states impose severe limits on voting by mail, and others impose draconian voter ID laws, which establish unfair criteria for what constitutes a valid photo ID. For example, in some states, hunting licenses are treated as a valid photo ID, while student ID cards are not. The student vote has been surging, as reported in this New York Times article from last October. The share of college students casting ballots doubled from 2014 to 2018 in areas, and in Texas and elsewhere, Republicans are erecting roadblocks for students. For example, in Florida, the Republican Secretary of State had outlawed early voting sites at state universities in 2014, but then a federal court overturned that ban, and they saw 60,000 students, voters, cast votes on campus. So this year, the state legislature cleverly reinstated such a ban by slipping a clause into the new elections law that requires all early voting sites to offer, quote, sufficient non-permitted parking, an amenity that is in very short supply on densely packed college campuses where most parking spaces you have to have a permit to park in it. Wisconsin Republicans have imposed tough restriction on using student IDs, and in New Hampshire, a law that the GOP passed in 2018 specifically targeted out-of-state college students with a poll tax by requiring them to obtain official residency in the state, which requires paying for things like a driver's license and car registration, which may, be hundreds of dollars. A federal lawsuit over that piece of legislation is scheduled to go to trial in May. But it's important to note that not all difficulties that voters encounter when voting are the result of partisan schemes to suppress their vote. Unfortunately, examples of long lines and excessive wait times at the poll, or the inability of poll workers to verify a voter's registration, occur under other circumstances. Such difficulties not only frustrate voters, but in many cases prevent them from casting a ballot. Typical cause for these types of voting problems include poor planning and wishful thinking by elections officials, an over-reliance on technology, inadequate funding, and inadequate testing of equipment and procedures. Such problems are more common than we would like, as documented in the many news stories from the primary elections held in a number of states on Super Tuesday, March 3rd. New York Times, why did it take so long to vote in Texas and California? Some voters stood in line for hours, but despite voter suppression, the primary breakdowns apparently reflected snafus more than malign intent. Washington Post, the scenario election officials feared, Russians hacking the vote, did not come to be on Super Tuesday, but the mega primary was bedeviled with a slew of serious technical glitches and frustrated voters. The government's top cybersecurity officials spent much of the day reassuring the public that the technology was the culprit, not Russia. Dallas Morning News, no one should wait 6 hours to vote, but in Texas, thousands did on Super Tuesday. Closer to home, this Washington Post article talks about Los Angeles County's bold effort to improve voting leads to malfunctioning equipment, long lines, angry voters. A new voting system in LA County faced its first big test on Super Tuesday, the culmination of a decade of work, but glitches caused long lines across the county. About 1/5 of the county's new touchscreen voting machines did not work properly and had to be replaced. Network problems interfered with electronic poll books and so on. And here's an interesting quote from the county's Democratic Party chair. We believed in the technology and we believed it would work because that's what we were told. And that's not what happened. Machines completely went out, voting centers completely shut down. And of course, we all remember the snafus with the Iowa primaries and their apps that didn't work. Sacramento B, data issues caused voting delays in these 15 counties. Network connectivity issue prevented those counties from accessing the state voter database. And in those counties, for the first several hours, people had to be sent home and told to come back to vote later. Okay, so enough of those horror stories. Unfortunately, even if all jurisdictions conducted elections that were accurate and verifiable, even if legislators and elections officials didn't engage in partisan schemes to suppress votes, even if every jurisdiction engaged in perfect planning and execution of their elections procedures so that everyone was able to cast their ballots with little difficulty, this would still not ensure that our elections reflect the overall will of the voters. And you can see a theme here. It wouldn't have been enough. It wouldn't have been enough. And so given this is Passover week, I was trying to figure out what the Hebrew word is for undayenu, but maybe somebody can help me with that. Anyway, so long as states continue to engage in partisan gerrymandering, and so long as courts fail to intervene to stop this practice, our elections will not be fair. Gerrymandering is perhaps the most pernicious threat to fair elections because in most cases, it predetermines the outcome of legislative contests before a single vote is cast in the general election. Pictured at left is former Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, even though it's spelled E-E-R-Y, he later served as President Madison's vice president. And in 1812, he oversaw the state's redistricting following the decennial census of 1810. The district shown on this map here in red was specifically designed to blunt the political influence of his opponent's party. The shape of the district vaguely resembled a salamander, and a cartoonist of that era dubbed it the gerrymander district or gerrymander district in honor of Governor Gerry. While there's debate about the correct pronunciation, I will pronounce it gerrymandering because that's what most people do. Over 200 years later, following Obama's stunning 2008 victory, Republican National Committee Chair Gillespie and Karl Rove, pictured it right, hatched Project Red Map to capture control of state legislatures in the 2010 election. They gained control of legislatures in states that held 40% of all seats in the US House versus 10% for the Democrats. The following election, after redistricting, Democratic candidates for the US House outpolled Republican candidates nationwide by roughly 1.4 million votes. But Republicans emerged with a 33-seat majority in the House. 7 states gerrymandered by the GOP were key to that: Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin. This was a huge strategic victory and one which led Rove to boast in a Wall Street Journal editorial, quote, he who controls redistricting can control Congress. Okay, so we're going to change gears here and look at a short video on gerrymandering.
Partisan redistricting, or gerrymandering, is about fractions, percentages. These coins represent voters in an evenly divided state, 50 dimes, 50 pennies. They elect 10 representatives. That means each district map must contain 10 coins. Of course, real people don't live in neat rows, so let's mix them up. This is our hypothetical state. Let's see what happens if the dimes draw the maps. 10 coins in each district. So first thing we do is pack the pennies. Give them 2 safe districts, but pack them solid. The remaining 8 districts are won by the dimes, by smaller but still comfortable margins. The dimes win 8 districts and the pennies win 2. The dimes overwhelmingly controlled the legislature. Of course, if the pennies drew the district lines, the opposite could happen. Let's rig it for the pennies. For the pennies, we pack the dimes into 2 safe districts and crack the remaining 8 districts and win by the same margin, 8-2. Well, now that we've destroyed democracy, let's consider how this would look if the maps were drawn based on compactness and keeping communities of interest together. You get evenly divided districts in an evenly divided state. There are some that go heavily dime, there are some that go penny, but that's to be expected. People live where they live, and that's what democracy is about. It's not about party bosses rigging elections for them.
This diagram shows the evolution of Pennsylvania's 7th congressional district, showing the changes in that district's boundary following each successive decennial census. The most recent redistricting, which occurred following the 2010 census, and Project Red Map's successful capture of the Pennsylvania state legislature, resulted in one of the most gerrymandered congressional districts in the country. Geographers have nicknamed this district Goofy Kicking Donald Duck in honor of 2 Disney cartoon characters that vaguely resemble the shape of this district. And this is what the district looks like. Here's Goofy, here's Donald Duck, overlaid on a map of Pennsylvania. This map shows the 2016 election results in each of Pennsylvania's 18 congressional districts. Republicans received 54% of all US House votes cast statewide, but succeeded in capturing 13 out of 18, or over 72% of its states, of its state seats in the House of Representatives. This map shows the 2018 election results in each of North Carolina's 13 congressional districts. Republicans received 50% of all US House votes in that state, but succeeded in capturing 9 out of the 13 seats in the House, or over 69%. On the graph underneath, it shows the black line illustrates the Republican share of the US House votes statewide, and the red line shows their share of the seats in the Congress. And 2010 census was here. This was the first election after the redistricting occurred. Wisconsin's gerrymandering is even more apparent. This is 2018 election results. This was a wave election in which the Democratic Party swept all of the statewide offices and garnered 53% of all the assembly votes cast in that state. But thanks to Wisconsin's gerrymandering seawall, the Republicans won 63 out of 99 of the assembly seats, or 63.6. So this was the share of the votes they got. This was the share of the seats. Lest anyone get the mistaken impression that only Republicans engage in gerrymandering, take a look at Maryland's 3rd congressional district, which made the top 10 list of gerrymandered districts in the country. This district, which has been nicknamed the Praying Mantis, represents the artwork of that state's Democratic legislature. This diagram shows 6 out of the 10 most geographically torturous gerrymandered congressional districts. 8 of the top 10 were drawn by Republican legislatures, 2 by Democratic ones. During the past decade, various lawsuits have been filed in state and federal courts against extremely partisan gerrymanders that took place following the 2010 census. In several state and federal cases, courts ruled that these gerrymanders were unconstitutional, either under the US Constitution or the Constitution of the given state, and they ordered the legislators to redraw fairer maps. While some maps have been redrawn as a result of those court cases, others have been appealed to higher courts. 2 of those cases, one concerning the Republican gerrymander in North Carolina, and the other, a Democratic gerrymander in Maryland, were consolidated and heard by the US Supreme Court last spring. Good government groups across the nation fervently hoped that the Supreme Court would strike down such partisan gerrymanders as unconstitutional. Unfortunately, in this landmark case, Rucco et al. Versus Common Cause et al., the Supreme Court punted, ruling that partisan gerrymandering claims presented political questions beyond the reach of the federal courts. As a result, the battle against partisan gerrymanders will be confined to state courts and litigated on the basis of each state's constitutional provisions and legal doctrines. If states and jurisdictions successfully address the first four items on our list of threats to fair elections, then most state and federal elections would more accurately and fairly reflect the will of the voters. Dayenu. But so long as the vote of the Electoral College can override the national popular vote for president, then whenever that happens, we cannot describe such an election result as fair. Article 2, Section 1 of the US Constitution gives state legislatures the sole authority, as well as wide latitude, for determining the manner in which the state's electors are appointed to the Electoral College. Every state gets 2 electoral votes, 1 for each senator, plus 1 additional electoral vote for each congressional district in that state. Currently, states use one of 2 approaches for appointing their electors. 40 states use the winner-take-all model, while 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate electors on the basis of congressional districts. Up until the current century, most voters paid little attention to the Electoral College vote, since its result normally matched the outcome of the national popular vote. The Bush v. Gore presidential election of 2000 was the first time since 1888 where the winner of the national popular vote, which Gore won by over 500,000 votes, lost the vote in the Electoral College. In this case, by a margin of 4 electoral votes out of a total of 537 cast. Bush's margin of victory in the Florida popular vote was a scant 537 votes out of roughly 6 million cast, or a margin of roughly 0.009%. In the Trump v. Clinton presidential election of 2016, Clinton won the national popular vote by over 2.8 million votes out of roughly 129 million, while losing the Electoral College vote to 27 to 304. Trump won a number of battleground states with tiny margins and a shift of less than 78,000 votes overall spread across 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, would have tipped the electoral vote to Clinton. This Electoral College vote was unusual in that it had the highest number of faithless electors on record. A total of 10 electors failed to vote as pledged. The 3 faithless electors from Colorado were replaced with faithful ones, leaving 7 electoral votes that were recorded for candidates other than Trump or Clinton. Had Clinton won Michigan and Pennsylvania, but not Wisconsin, then neither candidate would have received a majority of the Electoral College votes. And in that case, the selection of president would have fallen to the US House of Representatives, where the congressional delegation from each state would each have just 1 vote. It's hard to imagine how the country would have reacted to that outcome. The large number of faithless electors who participated in the 2016 Electoral College vote has raised anew the question of whether states can legally compel electors to vote as pledged. The Supreme Court previously addressed this question in its 1952 decision, Ray v. Blair, and at that time, the court majority upheld state laws requiring electors to vote as pledged. On January 17th of this year, the Supreme Court heard 2 challenges to state laws that were invoked in 2016 to punish that year's 10 faithless electors. The outcome of the court decision could impact the result of the 2020 Electoral College if that result is close and if some of this year's electors prove to be faithless. Based on the outcomes of the 2016 presidential elections, the Electoral College, to me, constitutes a ticking time bomb with the potential to upend this year's presidential contest. But those two pivotal elections have also had a profound impact on this country's national response to another ticking time bomb, climate change. In both cases, the candidates who lost the Electoral College vote, despite having won the national popular vote by large margins, were advocates of strong action to address climate change. While the winners of the Electoral College, once elected, promptly took actions to withdraw the US from existing climate agreements. In 2001, Bush withdrew the US from the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and in 2017, Trump initiated the US withdrawal from the 2015 Paris Agreement. Accordingly, one can argue that the Electoral College shares at least part of the blame for our nation's abject failure to adequately address climate change. So I've talked about various threats to the conduct of our elections in the US. Let's look at some of the efforts to address those. Whoops. Many politicians and activists have proposed amending the Constitution to abolish the Electoral College. Unfortunately, this is not likely given that you need 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate, and more importantly, ratification by 3/4 of the states, or 38 states. At least 13 small states, sufficient to block ratification, would be unlikely to agree to such an amendment since it would weaken their electoral clout. Fortunately, there's another solution that does not require a constitutional amendment. It leaves the Electoral College intact, but would ensure that the outcome of the Electoral College vote would match the winner of the national popular vote. The solution is called the National Popular Vote, or MPV. As mentioned earlier, the relevant section of the Constitution gives state legislatures wide latitude in how to select their electors. NPV would create a binding multi-state compact between those states that enact the MPV legislation. States that join the compact commit to pledging their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. The compact becomes legally binding as soon as enough states join such that their combined electoral votes equal or exceed 270, which is the number needed to win the Electoral College. To date, MPV multi-state compact legislation has been enacted in 15 states and the District of Columbia. Those jurisdictions comprise 196 electoral votes in total. For the compact to be legally binding, at least 5 more states with a total of 74 additional votes need to join. For example, enactment of MPV by 5 purple states, Virginia, North Carolina, Michigan, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania, would provide the needed additional votes. And the NPV compact has already been passed by 1 legislative chamber in 4 of those 5 states. So this looks promising. Unfortunately, there have been some recent disappointments. While the NPV compact was passed last year by both houses in Nevada, it was vetoed by that state's Democratic governor out of concerns about decreased tourism during presidential election years. The compact also recently passed Virginia's House, but failed to pass its Senate, even though both were controlled by Democrats. The biggest concern is that Colorado Republicans have succeeded in putting a referendum on the November 2020 ballot, asking voters to repeal that state's enactment of the MPV compact. Colorado's Republican Senator Cory Gardner is actively backing the repeal effort. His Democratic challenger, former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper, unfortunately supports retaining the Electoral College, but so far appears to be silent regarding the MPV repeal referendum. What to do about gerrymandering? Well, as noted previously, federal level court challenges to gerrymandered districts are precluded by last year's Supreme Court decision, and any challenges to those districts must now be litigated in state courts. The other approach to eliminating gerrymandering is to take the redistricting power away from state legislatures and instead give that responsibility to independent redistricting commissions, as we have done in California. In most states, this can be accomplished either by state level legislation, although it's rare for a state legislature to voluntarily give up its redistricting power, or it can occur as a result of a citizen-sponsored initiative. The feasibility of state-level challenges to gerrymandered district maps depends on the provisions of a given state's constitution and the composition of its state Supreme Court, since that's where such challenges will now most likely be decided. And we're gonna skip ahead here a little bit. As for successful challenges, the state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania ruled that existing congressional district maps were clearly an extreme partisan gerrymander and a violation of that state's constitution. They required maps to be redrawn. State courts in North Carolina ruled its maps violated the free elections clause of that state's constitution. The next set of slides will show the results of those court-ordered decisions. So we saw this slide before. Pennsylvania in 2016, under the old map, they got 54% of the votes for Congress, but they won 13 of 18 seats. After the court-ordered redrawing, Republicans, in this case, 2018, got 45% of the House votes and won 9 of 18 seats. Still not quite where you would want it to be, but certainly better. Similar results in North Carolina. The original map locked in a 10-3 advantage for the Republican Party. After the court-ordered redrawing, that dropped down to an 8-5 advantage. So, independent redistricting commissions on this map, the states in gray have established independent redistricting commissions, and many of them are producing maps that are reasonably fair. Unfortunately, in states where those commissions were created as a result of citizen initiatives, legislatures have not taken kindly to losing their power to draw district maps. And in fact, the state of Arizona filed a case with the Supreme Court to requesting that independent redistricting commissions be ruled unconstitutional. Thankfully, in a landmark 2015 decision, the US Supreme Court rejected an attempt by the Arizona state legislature to have that state's redistricting commission ruled unconstitutional, thereby affirming the constitutionality of such commissions. Like many such commissions, Arizona's had been created as a result of a citizen's initiative. Okay, Slay the Dragon. This is a recently released documentary about the successful citizen initiative to end gerrymandering in Michigan. It's on on Amazon Prime starting April 3rd. I think it's $7. It'll be in theaters once we're allowed to go to theaters again. This is an outstanding documentary that not only provides a detailed look at gerrymandering in several states, but it chronicles the amazing efforts of Katie Fahey, pictured here, a young activist in her 20s who led the successful grassroots campaign to ban partisan gerrymandering in Michigan. As the founder of Voters Not Politicians, she organized thousands of volunteers who collected over 425,000 voter signatures without the use of paid signature gatherers for Proposition 2. A ballot initiative amending the Michigan State Constitution to create an independent redistricting commission. On November 6th, the state electorate voted overwhelmingly to pass Proposal 2. And so this is a story we need to see repeated in other states, and it's amazing to see another young woman taking the initiative. We need more young ladies like Katie Fahey and Greta Thunberg and she shows that one person really can make a difference. There are now 17 states with redistricting commissions, a little over a third, and we need to carry this to the other 33. Earlier this year, signatures were being gathered in Arkansas, Nebraska, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Oregon for initiative measures that would appear on the November 3rd ballot to establish independent redistricting commissions in those states. Unfortunately, COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders have halted signature gathering for now. Hopefully, they will get back to that in time to get these ballot measures on the November ballot. Okay, we've come up on an hour here. I'm going to run over. We'll try and leave as much of the next half hour for questions. I want to talk briefly about federal legislation that's pending to address these issues. There are two major bills, H.R. 1, H.R. 4, that would take care of a lot of the things we've talked about in this talk. Neither are going to advance in the Republican-controlled Senate, but these bills are teed up and ready to move if the Democrats retain control of the House and take control of the Senate. While a few smaller bills to fund voting equipment and cybersecurity have managed to make it through Congress, they don't do nearly enough. Major bills like this and other election-related things are all blocked in the Senate by McConnell. So H.R. 1 covers voting, campaign finance, and ethics, and H.R. 4 tries to repair the damage done by the Supreme Court Shelby versus Holder decision, which gutted portions of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. H.R. 1 is huge. It's 705 pages. We'll just, expands voter registration, enhances election security and integrity, covers voter purges, makes elections day a federal holiday, promotes independent redistricting commissions, alternative funding for campaigns, election security, expanding disclosure, and ethics provisions for all three branches of government. And H.R. 4, again, repairing the Voter Rights Act, which, is amazing. It was reauthorized by the Congress in 2006. Incredible bipartisan support, 98-0 in the Senate, 390-3 in the House, signed by George Bush. And yet in 2013, in an infamous decision, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that portions of the law were outdated and rescinded those. So what can you do to support these efforts? We've already got independent redistricting here. Our senators are co-sponsors of most of the reform legislation pending in the Congress. So it's particularly important for us to convince our friends and family in other areas to support citizens' initiatives for redistricting commissions, urge their states to join, or in the case of Colorado, remain in the MPV multi-state compact. Encourage them to vote for state legislators and judges who oppose gerrymandering and vote suppression and support laws to promote for elections and voting access. Perhaps most urgently for all of us is to advocate to our members of Congress that the next stimulus funding bill has got to have more money in it to prepare for the November elections and to support the USPS so that it'll be here to be able to handle ballots in November. And for those of us who are able, it's important to donate to organizations that fight for fair elections. And these are some of them: Verified Voting, which I volunteered with for years, pushing election integrity legislation, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Brennan Center, ACLU, who have been at the forefront of legal battles on gerrymandering, voting rights. Okay, so we'll quickly try and get through COVID-19. Where things are now, it's already had the impact of reducing news coverage for the presidential contest and lowering turnouts. We've seen reduced availability of poll workers and census enumerators, which is troubling because those enumerators are important for contacting the hard to reach people who aren't counted by mail forms or online forms. And of course, they're reluctant to go out into communities without proper protective equipment. We've seen many primaries delayed. Those states that didn't delay, for example, Illinois went ahead with its primary on March 17th. Election day turnout in Chicago was down over 720,000 votes compared to 2016. And of course, many polling sites in Chicago had poll worker shortages. I've been trying to keep this slide up to date, but have given up. It's all of the different primaries that have been delayed, states that are now switching to entirely vote by mail in green. We'll move on here. April 7th primary in Wisconsin. What can I say other than this was a terrible travesty? Here, a state was under shelter-in-place orders. Mayors and the governor were pleading with the legislature to delay the primary. They refused to do it. Few polling sites were available in cities due to shortage of poll workers. Milwaukee, that would normally have 180 polling sites operating, had 5. National Guard was called up to try and run polling places, but they didn't have training. There was a huge crush of applications for absentee ballots to voters that overwhelmed elections departments and the post office, such that a lot of voters would not get their absentee ballot until after election day. And there was a flurry of legal battles between the federal court, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and finally our own US Supreme Court, who really dropped the ball on this. And so this election went ahead when it shouldn't have, and voters who didn't get their absentee ballots in time were forced with the choice of, well, do I go expose myself to infection, or do I just give up my right to vote? So this is a picture of some of the long lines of voters and with their masks waiting many hours to cast their votes in Milwaukee. So why were the Republicans doing this? One of the key races on that ballot was for a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It was a conservative Republican incumbent facing a popular progressive challenger. The Republicans know that any state challenges to Wisconsin's gerrymandered districts are going to land before that court. And so they're doing whatever they can to make sure that they maintain a conservative majority there. And to put voters through this for that is, in my opinion, despicable. So other impacts going forward, we have impaired signature gathering for ballot initiatives. When will campaigning be safe to resume? Who knows? Party conventions, the Democratic convention's already been delayed into August, although Biden has suggested it may be a virtual convention. And, key thing on all, will we have another wave of COVID-19 in the fall? Epidemiologists are saying this is an issue. And will that make in-person voting too dangerous on November 3rd? We have to prepare for that. And so it's vital that whatever stimulus bills go forward have adequate funding for states to implement the changes they'll need to ensure that all voters can safely cast their vote in November. And we need to make sure that the US Postal Service gets funding now to cover its needs. So voting, national vote by mail. We already have a trend we can see here. The green line is increasing use of vote by mail all across the country. Purple line decreasing in-person voting. So most jurisdictions already have at least some level of election infrastructure in place to support absentee ballots. We already have 3 states, the ones in purple, that their elections are entirely vote by mail, and in the case of Washington and Oregon have been for quite some years. The states that are in orange are like California. Anyone who wants to vote by mail can vote by mail. Those in green, you have to have an excuse. And in some cases, it's very, very difficult to get an absentee ballot. And that will need to change for November as well. We need no excuse absentee voting in all 50 states. We need deadlines that are realistic, and we need support for the post office. There are a number of federal bills to deal with this. A couple that introduced last year, one by Senator Klobuchar, was sort of for general disaster preparedness. It only covers the federal races, probably not a good solution here. And then March 11th, Senator Wyden and Representative Blumenauer from Oregon introduced the Resilient Elections During Quarantines and Natural Disasters Act of 2020, which has a lot of good provisions, but the most comprehensive one and the one that needs to go forward now was introduced March 18th by Senators Klobuchar and Wyden working together. It's the Natural Disaster and Emergency Ballot Act of 2020. It has 24 co-sponsors, all Democrats, including both of our senators. And it's the most comprehensive solution to get elections officials and infrastructure up to speed in all states. Provides 20 days of early in-person voting, no excuse absentee voting everywhere, online requests for vote-by-mail ballots, acceptance of vote-by-mail ballots up to 10 days after Election Day, and importantly, self-sealing envelopes with prepaid postage and tracking barcodes so that people can track the delivery of their ballot. So I'll conclude with this section with this slide, which I think speaks for itself. There's a lot of pushback from Republicans in the right wing saying, oh, voter fraud, mail-in ballots are horrible. Even the president himself is, but thankfully, even Republican governors and secretaries of state are coming forward and saying, yes, we need vote by mail for all voters in November. Okay, well, to wrap up, as I think I've made clear, our democracy has very serious problems, and major federal reforms are going to await a shift in political power in Washington. But as we've seen, state and local level solutions are possible through state court challenges, citizens initiatives. You know, I think it's important for people to realize how much attention they need to pay to state and local contests. A lot of people say, well, I vote for president, I don't worry about the down ballot stuff. Well, it's the down ballot stuff that determines how elections happen. Determines, you know, whether there are, you know, secure voting systems, whether there are enough resources. And so if you care about the presidential race, you need to care about these down ballot races that determine the playing field for how elections are conducted. This is probably the most consequential election of our lifetimes. It's going to be key in terms of redistricting. And again, this comes back to the state level races for state legislatures. They're the ones still doing the bulk of the redistricting. And it's important in terms of the courts, which are going to be key players in the battles to come. And finally, once again, stimulus funding for an election, in the November election, and the post office is urgently needed. Now, a lot of this is very bleak. I'd like to leave you with the hopeful thought that although the progress is uneven, I think we're making, you know, it's maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we have some great examples of state courts stepping up to the plate, citizens initiatives, individuals, all working together to try and make our democracy more fair. And so with that, I think we will, Melissa, are you going to look through and try and come up with the questions that we'll try and deal with in the last 15 minutes?
I was thinking maybe, Bob, if you people could just you could look in the chat. I don't see a lot of questions right now, but you could just look in the chat and see.
Okay, well then I'll just try and take from the this one. If the vote went to the House and one state had an uneven number of congressmen and they split evenly, what would happen? Good question. I will try and find an answer to that. Okay, district elections. How are those drawn, the lines for that? I believe that would be a collaboration between the entity involved. You know, if it's a school district, it would be, you know, the county schools, you know, and they would be using census data, working probably with the elections department, because you need to draw districts that have roughly equal numbers of people in them. But I have to say that's that issue is not one that I have expertise in, but I will try and look into. Okay, NAACP continues to be a primary voting rights organization. Yes, and they have done a lot of good work in this area and are certainly worthy of support as well. Jerry asks, why would a state that wants power willingly join the MPV compact? I imagine they would hope every other state joins, which would split dilute those states' results, while their own results would be tabulated at 100%. I'm not sure I understand the question. No, the NPV just needs enough states to comply that when they do comply, they give 270 electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. Once you get to 270 votes in the electoral college, you win. Okay, so what the other states do with their electors becomes irrelevant at that point. So Jerry, let me know if that answered your question. Am I familiar with Microsoft Election Guard software? I am not, but since you've provided the link, we will take a look at that. I will mention, you know, I mentioned internet voting and the difficulties with that. One of the big drivers for that is to try and provide a solution for our military voters who are overseas. It's very difficult for them to vote absentee because they move around out on the battlefield. And so if there's a piece of mail that's directed to them and you know, it goes to Baghdad and arrive, you know, where they might have been at the time they asked for the absentee ballot, but by the time the ballot gets there, they're now in Fallujah or some other place. So that's a trick. And the best way to address that is to be able to initiate requests for absentee ballots over the internet. That can be done in a relatively secure way. And, you know, to actually be able to have the capability to print a ballot remotely over the internet, you know, a blank ballot. And in fact, the election suite that we have now in Santa Cruz County has that capability. So a military person in you know, South Korea or Italy or wherever can make the application, get authorization to print a ballot wherever they happen to be at that time. And then once they've marked the ballot, they can then put that into the military post. And that's a much simpler problem. Getting the ballot back from Italy or South Korea to the Santa Cruz elections office is a simpler problem because the Santa Cruz elections office doesn't move. Okay, so that's one way of cutting the problem in half. There was a pilot program conducted by Washington, D.C. For internet voting. And they contracted with an internet voting outfit and they said, oh yes, we have this totally, absolutely secure system. In fact, we're so confident that it's unhackable that we will do a pilot test and we will invite hackers to give it their all. Well, the system was not as secure as they thought. And Professor Alex Haldeman, a computer science professor at University of Michigan, and his graduate students managed to penetrate the system a little over a day. They totally owned it. They changed all the votes. They changed the voter registrations. They even changed it so that people, when they logged in to vote on the web interface, when they completed their vote, it played the University of Michigan football team fight song. And while they were there, they also noticed they were not alone. They saw probes and intrusions coming from Kazakhstan, North Korea, and other places around the world. So needless to say, DC decided not to go ahead with internet voting. And there's actually some fairly serious academic papers written by Haldeman and his team describing all of the vulnerabilities that they did. And, you know, it would be great if you know, and maybe at some point in the future, that will be an option, but the underlying internet infrastructure really isn't there yet to support voting. And voting's a really fundamentally different transaction than a commercial transaction, because there's the whole issue of maintaining the secrecy, the ballot privacy, and that makes the security problem much harder. Okay, so some other questions that have come in. Is there a correlation between states that have not chosen to return to paper ballots and those that have passed voter suppression laws? Quite possibly, but I would have to look at that more carefully to give you an answer, and I will try and do that. Is it fair that students are allowed to vote in local elections? You know, there are lots of people who aren't students who may come to town for, you know, a short period of time, a year or two on a contract and then move on. Is it fair for them to vote? The way the election codes are written is where you're living. You know, I mean, any of us, you know, could decide, well, I'm going to move next year. I mean, so I understand that there's a reluctance for people to say, well, they're just here for a short time, they shouldn't have a say, but they are living here. They are living here for 1, 2, 3, 4 years. There's no reason they should have any less of a say than anyone else in those circumstances. Okay, is it possible what Trump is currently trying to do with the post office? Well, it's not Trump alone, it's Trump and the you know, Republican controlled Senate. They have put requirements on the post office to fully fund pensions out into, you know, 2080 or something. And so I don't know the motivation. I know that some of Trump's supporters have been trying to privatize other aspects of the government, like the Weather Service, and there may be Trump supporters who want to privatize the post office for their own profit. But I can't get inside his head, so I don't know exactly what his motivation to do. But, you know, every nation on earth has a post office, for goodness sakes. And, you know, we've had one since the founding of the country, and it needs our support. Okay, will any of these election reforms counter the ongoing ramifications of Citizens United? I believe there are some provisions in HR 1 that may speak to that, and I will look at that and see if I can, you know, point you to, as I say, it's a 705-page long bill, so there's a lot there. There's certainly language in there, I know, to require increased transparency for fundraising. There's also provisions to provide some federal funding for federal races. So, okay, what else have we got here? All right, well, I think that's all the questions that are in the chat box so far. We have about another 5 minutes if anyone has questions that'd like to get in, and I'm gonna save a copy of the chat box here so I have a record of these questions, and hopefully I can figure out from people's names their email addresses. If you're someone who has asked a question who is not in the Temple directory, then maybe you want to put your email address in the checkbox so that I can get back to you. So if there are no other questions, I'll throw out one other thing. I have about 3 times as many slides as I had to show, but we'll give you all a pop quiz. And one of the things that I used to get into with various elections officials, secretaries of state, county clerks across the country is that say, oh, well, you know, we can trust these electronic voting machines because we do these logic and accuracy tests before every election. You know, we do them here in this county. And they're a useful test. They will detect whether there's anything grossly wrong with the machine, but, you know, they're typically a small test. Well, they'll, you know, vote 25 or 50 ballots and, you know, as in a test election, and they know what votes they've put in, and then they see if the machine spits out the correct totals, and they say, oh, passed the test, it's working, it must be trustworthy. Well, for those of you who know about computer software, especially software, if you're allowed to keep it secret, you can make software that'll pass that test easily and steal votes on election day. You know, a very simple test would be, oh, I look at the date. Is it election day? Oh, well, then I can do my cheating. If it's not election day, this must be a pre-election test. Or count honestly for the first, you know, 150 votes. And after you've counted 150 votes, then take every second vote for candidate X and give it to candidate Y. You know, you're not going to detect that in a logic and accuracy test. I mean, there's a zillion ways you can write fraudulent software that'll pass a logic and accuracy test. And so the reply I would get to that is, oh, no major corporation would ever do such a thing, as if they ever got caught, they'd be out of business. You know, it would damage their reputation. You know, that could never, ever possibly happen. No major corporation would write fraudulent software that would pass a test, that could tell when it was being tested and pass the test, and tell when it was not being tested and do something fraudulent. So can any of you out there think of a corporation that did such a thing, a major corporation that sells products all around the world? Any takers?
Was it Diebold?
No. This is not a voting system company. This is a something that a lot of you, some of you may even own one of these.
Volkswagen.
Volkswagen, exactly. Dieselgate. It's the exactly analogous thing. And this was a fraud that went on for 5 or 6 years, involved tens of millions of vehicles sold across the world, having to do with the emissions controls. The software could tell, oh, I'm in the smog station getting my smog test. Okay, I'll turn on the emissions controls. And when I'm out on the highway, I can tell that I'm out on the highway. I'll turn off the emissions controls and we'll get better mileage. You know, Volkswagen got fined billions of dollars from that, but you know, they're still in business. They're still selling cars. So I wish I had had that example to cite, you know, 20 years ago when I was having these debates with voting systems officials. So if Volkswagen can risk their corporate reputation and billions of dollars in fines, think of a voting system company who says, oh, well, I can swing the presidential election. What's that worth? So anyway, thank you all for your participation today. If you have other questions that come up afterwards about this that you'd like me to try and answer, please send them to me by email. And thanks to Melissa and Marlene for all their great help in getting this organized and publicized. And hopefully the recording will come out okay and we can get that posted for people who were not able to participate this afternoon.
That was great.
Thank you very much, Bob. You did it.
Maria, thanks for your comment about the NAACP still being active in voting rights.
Yeah, and if you, I think on some of the slides where I cited which organizations were participating in lawsuits, NAACP was certainly in several of those. I believe they are a big part of the litigation involving the Florida felon
Yes.
reinstatement, something I didn't have time to talk to, but essentially voters in Florida overwhelmingly passed an initiative to restore felon voting rights. Florida legislature has been fighting this tooth and nail. It's still in the courts, and we don't know whether those felons will have a chance to vote in November or not. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going
Thanks,
to
Bob. I appreciate
sign
it.
off.
Thanks, Bob.
Excellent.
Thank you, Marlene.
Hi, Barry.
Thank you for being here.
Hi, Marlene.
See you next Tuesday for something completely different. Bruce Thompson on Jews and the Wizard of Oz. It'll be great.
It's
Very
next
different.
Tuesday, not Monday?
It's actually Tuesday. Yes, I'm going to have to emphasize that. It's not Monday because he's teaching as a teaching conflict. So it'll be Tuesday, the 21st at the same time, 2 o'clock.
Okay, I'm writing that down.
Thank you, Marlene.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody.
Hi.
Really great.
Thank
Stay well, everyone.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Marlene.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Oh, you're on.
Thanks, Melissa.
Sure, you're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Melissa.
Sure.
Thanks, Melissa.
You're welcome.